For some unknown reason, I picked Scott Hall and Sean Waltman to be my friends.
Why did you do that? Why?
There comes a time when enough is enough, and it's time for a change. The late great Owen Hart knew that, but unfortunately the rest of the wrestling world didn't quite get that memo, as trends have been beaten into the ground far past their point of popularity. One such gimmick is the nWo. In the defense of bookers and wrestlers everywhere, it's understandable being inspired by one of the most influential stories and iconic stables in wrestling history. It is, that's completely valid. But sometimes, you just need to know when to leave well enough alone. In 2010, 8 years after their failed stint in WWE, and 14 years after their debut, TNA Wrestling decided that they too now wanted to be in the nWo business, even when there was no real business to speak of there. Hulk Hogan, the leader and one of the former founding fathers of the New World Order, signed with TNA Wrestling, looking to change the face of wrestling, or whatever his false promise was. With a position in power, which is what the group fought for in WCW, and knowing that they had an inside man who was their original inside man, the nWo's core members would return to TNA during Hogan's debut. The boys were looking to get the band back together, but Hulk Hogan politely declined, with Eric Bischoff also coming out to interject that times had changed, and basically gave the same speech he gave when WCW rebooted in 2000. Because, it works so well there, why not duplicate it here? Hogan and Bischoff claimed that everyone would have to earn their spot in TNA, which led to the would-be Wolfpack jumping the roster at random like this was 1996. Hall and Waltman would be asked to leave the Impact Zone due to not being contracted wrestlers, whereas Big Kev already was. But that didn't stop them from showing up whenever they wanted, and then eventually turning on their old pal Big Kev. Shockingly and seemingly for no reason, the 1-2-3 Man and Razor Ramon beat down Big Daddy Cool, so it was decided that they would settle their issues at the upcoming pay-per-view Destination X. If Hall and Six managed to beat Kevin Nash and Eric Young, they'd receive actual contracts, but if they lost, they'd have to leave the company for good. In hindsight, I really wish they lost. Instead, what we got was a swerve for the sake of a swerve, as Nash turned on Young shortly into the match and allowed his bandmates to get the victory. Now look, I understand why this was done. This was to officially get Six and Scott actual contracts. It was a total ruse. But there were better ways of doing this, and much more interesting ways of spending pay-per-view time. You could have started with Scott and Pac coming in, and have Nash not wanting to be affiliated with the team from the start, instead of turning him face just to turn him heel again. You could have also just given the guys their contracts like they had in real life. There were so many other people from that generation getting TNA contracts at this time anyway, they would have fit right in. But I get it, you wanted to make the outsiders outsiders, even though one of them was clearly an insider, so I don't get it. I'm sorry, I take the whole thing back. The angle gets that much more goofy when you realize despite being turned on and getting beat down, Eric Young would be offered a place with the group shortly thereafter. While EY rejected their initial offer, choosing to be a good guy fighting against the bad guys, he'd eventually cave and become a staple of that stable. So, on paper, the band was Nash, Hall, and X-Pac, until Nash got kicked out of the team so that he could team with Eric Young. Then he would betray Eric Young, rejoin the band, and then have Eric Young also join the team later on. Yeah, okay, great. That works. This had all the stupidity and senselessness of the swerves from the nWo angle, but it carried none of the weight, fan investment, or endearment of that angle. These were nonsensical decisions that make next to no sense. This had none of the intrigue of the original, none of the groundbreaking moments, and its attempt at blurring the lines was laughable. We're talking about a run that is so bad it would make nWo 2000 blush. But don't worry, because it's about to get worse. Since this was the Hogan administration and the Hulkster liked to hook up all of his friends, especially the ones who gave him hookups, the band brought in Bubba the Love Sponge as their own personal interviewer. Now, for all this guy has done and achieved in radio, this wasn't an avenue where he could properly apply his personality. He'd spend all of his segments standing there looking foolish, awkwardly holding a microphone for the team, and occasionally repeating the phrase, Bubba's Army. He did nothing for the team, and his stay was somehow even shorter than the rest of the angle. This man was hired in late March and fired by late April. Thanks for nothing, Bubba. But the absolute strangest decision in a long line of bad booking had to come when TNA, in their infinite wisdom, decided to give these guys the straps. Despite the angle never getting over and the team not working as effortlessly as they once had, it was decided to make Scott Hall and Kevin Nash the TNA World Tag Team Champions. Belts that they would never properly win, and belts that they would never actually lose. You see, Nash was carrying a briefcase from the Feast or Fired match. The Feast or Fired match is really just a Money in the Bank match, except made more complicated and less fun. His case held a shot at the tag team titles. So when sole tag team champion Matt Morgan, yeah, these are all real things that were happening at the same time. When the tag team champions Matt Morgan was knocked out following an assault at the hands of Samoa Joe, the Outsiders took advantage of the situation and added another reign to their title history. Never mind that these were some of the most immobile men on the roster, heading a division of guys who worked at a much faster pace, but this was also a run that nobody was asking for. Though the company seemed to be aware of the first part of that sentence at least, as Eric Young was brought in to defend the titles under the Freebird rule, or in this case, the band rules. Not that any of that mattered, because the company would eventually take the titles off the Outsiders and Friend due to some legal issues Scott Hall was facing at the time. Of course, the smart thing would have just been to have Nash and Young defend the titles and lose them on their own, so as to not call more attention to the situation, and not have to vacate the top titles in your tag division, but then again, the smart thing would have been to just not have this angle at all. Both Waltman and Hall were fired from their TNA contracts, and Nash would break off his union with Eric Young, effectively disbanding the band. Or so it would seem.
To be continued.
As shortly thereafter, another iteration, or more accurately, a bastardization, of the team would form. Nash relentlessly tried to reason with Hogan and Bischoff to bring his friends back into the company, but when neither budged, he instead set his sights on the company's founder, Jeff Jarrett, who had been very vocal about his dislike of the two and claimed that Nash was hurting the company by bringing them back into it. And that's when the man called Sting would make his return to the company, and surprisingly take his former Wolfpack teammate's side against the Authority. What's important to remember here is that Hogan, Bischoff, and Jarrett were being displayed as babyfaces at the time, which is weird enough as it is. But then to set Sting up to be a heel going up against them just makes this whole thing feel like it takes place in Bizarro Land. And I'm not talking about Canada. Sting would start donning his red and black Wolfpack face paint, the colors he last wore in 1998, which, to be honest, felt a little ridiculous at this point. The two teamed with the former Elijah Burke, D'Angelo De Niro, who claimed to have some information on the regime. Why the Pope was suddenly aligned with the NWO Wolfpack in 2010 was anyone's guess, though I don't know anyone that cared enough to wager one. At the same time, Hogan, Bischoff, and Jarrett found a sacrificial lamb, an ally, in Samoa Joe, who was arguably in the worst period of his entire career. No shame in that, he's in good company here in this video. Eventually it was revealed that the band was right in their mistrust of management, as Hogan, Bischoff, and Jarrett would go on to form Immortal, which, to be fair, was a step up from whatever this was. It's hard to find anything to like with this reincarnation of the group, but I don't want to point the finger at those involved on screen, because it was those who pieced this angle together behind the scenes that are to blame. Bringing in the most popular stable in all of professional wrestling history on paper sounds good, but when you realize you're not writing on that paper in 1997, but rather 2010, and the gimmick has done no good for anybody since before the new millennium, and knowing that these guys are less mobile, less relevant, and more old, you should see the problem right off the bat. There were clearly several hurdles that this version of the team was never going to overcome. First off, the group couldn't legally call themselves the New World Order, because they didn't own the rights to that three-lettered name. Another company with a different three-lettered name did, so they wouldn't even be able to properly be identified or billed on the card. Instead, they were given the name The Band, a reference to their 2000 reunion, in which commentary stated that the band was getting back together. And sure, that's a clever way to reference them, but is this really the incarnation of the team that you want to be referencing? It's not even a callback to the group in their heyday. It's a callback to one of the worst periods in their career. A period which this period of time makes feel like a forgotten era. Another obvious thing they were up against was the passing of time. The gimmick which once set the wrestling world ablaze just didn't have the same spark that it once had. In 2010, no one was clamoring for another nWo reunion. The brand had endured far too much. We just wanted to remember the good old days and move on to something else. Anything else. We were all too far removed from this already. The pair that once had their finger on the pulse of what was relevant suddenly felt passé. But maybe most importantly, what this formation of the team had going against them was that these guys were clearly winding down with their in-ring work. They weren't working as fast or as often as they once did. They were years removed from their prime, both in terms of mobility and relevance. All due respect to those in the ring, but they shouldn't have been in that ring. At least not in this capacity. A fact which the company seemingly figured out by adding in additional members in Eric Young and later D'Angelo De Niro. Scott Hall specifically was in such bad shape that they had to employ creative workarounds to give him reasons that he couldn't compete, or alternatively, have him do the bare minimum in a match. Which is not me saying anything bad about the bad guy. He was an older man who had a lot of wear and tear on his body and was battling his own personal demons. The guy didn't have it easy, and unfortunately time was taking a toll. I think having these guys behind the scenes on creative, or maybe even a few of them offering up managerial services to a future star on the roster, could have been more beneficial than this. Their bodies weren't what they once were, but their minds were still as sharp as they'd ever been. They could have done something, but this shouldn't have been that something. There was merit in hiring the pioneers that shaped an industry for a generation. It's just the roles that you chose for them was not great on your part. The angle didn't resemble what it was based on. And by the end of it, the angle didn't even resemble the beginning of it. This run had failed before it ever began. In the historic run of the nWo in wrestling, their brief time in TNA is nothing more than a footnote in the postlude. I don't blame the guys for taking the money and making a return. Get paid to hang out with my friends, do minimal work, and try to recapture my glory days? Yeah, sure, where do you want me to sign? Why wouldn't they do that? The problem is really with creative. Because why would they do any of this? I get that they wanted to appeal to nostalgic 90s fans, but past their initial appearance, I don't think anything was accomplished. They didn't wind up putting anyone over in a big way. They didn't better the company through their involvement. They were just brought in as a cheap attempt to win over an audience during a cheap attempt at the Monday Night Wars. Past that, they didn't do anything of note. For better or worse, and believe you me, it's mostly worse, that was the nWo and TNA, and it was a waste of everybody's time. So if you like this video as much as I hated making it, and want to see more wrestling content here on the channel, maybe a video on more obscure nWo appearances, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Does Wolfpack Pride mean nothing to you?
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.